It's easy to remember the big names: Capone, Luciano, Rothstein. But before the syndicates formalized power, before the commission divided the country, the streets belonged to men most people have never heard of. In Brooklyn, Charles Vannie Higgins ran rum across dark water at high speed, then died shielding his daughter from gunfire. In Chicago, Spike O'Donnell survived machine gun ambushes and outlived the men who tried to erase him. In Southern Illinois, Charlie Birger fought both rival bootleggers and the Ku Klux Klan, then walked calmly to the gallows. In New York's Garment District, Kid Dropper Kaplan and Dopey Benny Fein turned labor strikes into battlegrounds. These were not polished bosses in tailored boardrooms. They were street kings, violent, political, temporary. And without them, the American Mafia would never have taken the shape it did. Tonight, we're stepping back into the years before organized crime became organized. These are the mobsters you've never heard of, but you should have. Frank Wallace was born on February the 19th, 1902, and he came up in South Boston at a time when the docks, the corner bars, and the ward politics all lived on the same streets. By the 1920s, he was known as an Irish-American gangster who ran the Gustin Gang, a South Boston crew that built its power on bootlegging and hijacking during Prohibition. Later histories trace Wallace's start to truck thefts with his brothers, a style of street crime built around delivery routes and quick grabs, before the money shifted toward alcohol. Once Prohibition hardened into daily life, the Gustin Gang leaned into the waterfront, rum running, and the steady business of stealing other people's liquor loads. Accounts of the gang describe members using false badges like Prohibition agents, taking shipments under the look of authority, then turning around and selling the stolen alcohol themselves. By the late 1920s and into 1931, Wallace's name sat at the center of a fight that mattered more than pride. It was about who controlled Boston's illegal rackets, and whether South Boston's Irish crews would stay independent, while Italian gangs in the North End pushed for dominance. When beer trucks started disappearing, the pressure tightened fast, and Wallace agreed to a sit-down meant to settle the hijackings. That meeting led him straight into a trap. On December 22, 1931, Frank Wallace and his lieutenant, Bernard Dodo Walsh, went to the offices of the CK Importing Company at 317 Hanover Street in Boston's North End. The sit-down was supposed to involve North End figures Joseph Lombardi and Philip Buckler. Instead, Wallace and Walsh were ambushed and shot to death at the building. Wallace was 29 years old when he was killed. The impact showed up in the street the way it always does, in who came out and who stayed quiet. Reporting and later historical work describe a funeral procession that stretched with more than 200 cars, many with out-of-state plates, a measure of how wide his connections ran and how closely South Boston watched one of its own go into the ground. The aftermath reshaped the city's underworld. Sources that track Boston organized crime describe Wallace as the last Irish leader to hold that level of power in the rackets before Italian groups consolidated control. A change that held for years and set the stage for the next era of Irish crews that would rise later, with different names and different neighborhoods, but the same old hunger for territory and money. Charles Vannie Higgins was born in 1897 in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. By the time Prohibition began in 1920, he was already seasoned by the system. As a teenager, he worked as a pickpocket and small-time thief, and by 1916 he had been arrested twice for assault and placed on probation. The early brushes with the law did not push him away from crime. They taught him how to move through it. When the Volstead Act took effect, Higgins organized a gang out of Bay Ridge. The demand for liquor was immediate, and the profits were enormous. By the mid-1920s, he had grown from a neighborhood operator into a major rum runner. His network included taxis and trucks for inland distribution, speedboats for offshore transfers, and even aircraft. Higgins was a licensed pilot and flying enthusiast. He used planes for both business and pleasure. One of his boats, the Cigarette, was described as among the fastest rum runners in New York waters. In 1927, Higgins and Frank Costello assumed control of bootlegging operations previously tied to Big Bill Dwyer. They specialized in high-quality Canadian liquor for upscale clients. That move elevated Higgins from a Brooklyn boss to a figure in the broader New York underworld. Violence followed expansion. During a trip to Baltimore, Higgins walked into a speakeasy in the middle of a gunfight between rival bootleggers. As he tried to leave, a police officer mistook him for one of the shooters and shot him in the leg. It was the kind of chaos that defined the Prohibition years. By the late 1920s, Higgins pushed into Manhattan, where he collided with Dutch Schultz. During the Manhattan Beer War, Higgins aligned himself with Jack Legs Diamond, Vincent Mad Dog Coll, and Anthony Little Orgy Carfano against Schultz's organization. Control of the city meant control of beer routes, warehouse space, and tavern supply. Higgins was arrested repeatedly. In the killing of Brooklyn bootlegger Samuel Orlando, he and William Bad Bill Bailey were charged after witnesses identified them as gunmen. By trial, the witnesses were gone. Higgins was acquitted. It became a pattern. Arrests came often. Convictions did not. He survived multiple attempts on his life. In one drive-by attack, rival gunmen sprayed his car with bullets, but Higgins and Bailey escaped. At another point, Higgins reportedly obtained grenades from a military arsenal and used them alongside Legs Diamond against Schultz-controlled speakeasies. The conflict escalated beyond backroom beatings into open urban warfare. Higgins cultivated an image. He wore expensive British suits, posed for photographers, and rode in limousines. He also enjoyed political protection. He once landed his airplane at the state prison in Comstock, New York, where he dined with Warden Joseph H. Wilson, a childhood friend. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt publicly criticized the visit, though no formal action followed. In March 1929, Higgins and Bailey were involved in a gun battle at the Owl Head Cafe at 69th Street and 3rd Avenue in Brooklyn. Patrolman Daniel J. Maloney was killed in the crossfire, struck by bullets fired by responding officers. Higgins fled. The violence surrounding him was no longer contained to gang members. Innocents and police were being pulled in. In 1931, Higgins entered the Blossom Heath Inn on West 57th Street to confront owner Frank McManus over a liquor dispute. McManus was the brother of George Hump McManus, a suspect in the 1928 murder of Arnold Rothstein. The argument turned physical, and Higgins was stabbed and seriously wounded. At Polyclinic Hospital, he refused to identify his attacker. Later that year, Higgins and Bailey were arrested in the death of Robert Whitey Benson, a member of Higgins's own crew suspected of informing Dutch Schultz about liquor shipments. Again, the case collapsed for lack of evidence. On the night of June 18, 1932, Higgins attended his daughter's tap dance recital at a Knights of Columbus clubhouse near Prospect Park. As he stood outside with his 7-year-old daughter, gunmen approached and opened fire. Higgins tried to shield the child and was hit multiple times. A patrolman rushed him to Methodist Episcopal Hospital. Even as he lay dying, he refused to tell police who shot him. He died on June 19, 1932. His death marked the decline of Irish dominance in Brooklyn's bootlegging world, as more centralized syndicate structures tightened control over New York rackets. Years later, British historian Jonathan Goodman proposed a theory linking Higgins to the 1931 death of Star Faithful, whose drowning on Long Island remains debated as accident, suicide, or homicide. Goodman suggested Higgins may have been involved in her abduction and death. No charges were ever filed against Higgins in that case, and the claim remains unproven. Charles Vannie Higgins built his power on speed, intimidation, and connections. He survived shootouts, stabbings, and indictments. In the end, he died the way many Prohibition figures did, in public under gunfire, with the life he built collapsing in a single burst of shots on a Brooklyn street. Benjamin Fein, known on the streets as Dopey Benny, was born in New York City around 1889. He grew up on the Lower East Side at a time when the neighborhood was crowded with immigrants, sweatshops, pushcarts, and tenement buildings stacked close enough to hear arguments through the walls. Poverty was common. So was crime. Fein began as a pickpocket and petty thief while still a boy. By 1905, at roughly 16 years old, he had organized his own gang of robbers. It was an early sign of what set him apart. He was not only willing to steal, he knew how to build a crew. Between 1905 and 1910, Fein was sent to Elmira Reformatory several times, including serving 3.5 years for armed robbery. Elmira was designed to reform young offenders, but for many inmates, it became a finishing school in criminal discipline. Fein emerged with contacts, experience, and a stronger appetite for control. After his release in 1910, he joined the organization of Big Jack Zelig, a powerful Lower East Side gang leader. Zelig's group operated in gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering. Fein moved quickly into labor slugging, the violent enforcement side of union disputes. Factories and unions hired gangs to intimidate rivals, break strikes, or force compliance. Fein rented out his men to both sides when it suited him. Control, not ideology, drove his decisions. By the early 1910s, Fein and rival Josef Rosenzweig dominated much of the labor racketeering in New York's garment district. Fein was reportedly earning as much as $20,000 a year, an enormous sum at the time. His nickname, Dopey Benny, came from a medical condition that left his eyelids half closed, giving him a drowsy expression that contrasted with his sharp organizational skills. In 1913, smaller gangs attempted to break the monopoly held by Fein and Rosenzweig. Tensions exploded into open warfare. A major gun battle erupted at Grand Street and Forsyth Street, lasting for hours. Few were killed, but the message was clear. The New York labor slugger war had begun. It would continue for nearly 4 years with shifting alliances, street ambushes, and constant arrests. In 1914, Fein was arrested for assault. Facing pressure and apparently abandoned by some of his political protectors, he agreed to testify against other labor sluggers. His cooperation led to indictments against 11 gangsters and 21 union officials. None of those cases ultimately went to trial. The machinery of Tammany Hall-era politics often protected those with the right connections. That same year, Fein was arrested for the murder of Frederick Strauss, a court clerk killed during a shootout near St. Mark's Place. Strauss had been caught in crossfire. Fein was charged but later released when witnesses could not place him at the scene with certainty. In 1915, Fein was again arrested and convicted on a murder charge connected to the ongoing labor violence. He served time and was released in 1917. By then, the landscape had shifted. Rosenzweig was in prison for manslaughter. The gang war had burned through much of its leadership. Fein's influence had weakened, and he chose to step away from open gang activity. After leaving the street wars, Fein entered the garment business legitimately. For years, his name disappeared from the headlines. The man who once commanded squads of sluggers now operated in the same industry he had once terrorized. The quiet did not last forever. In July 1931, Fein appeared in court for the first time in 13 years. He was arraigned at Essex Market Court on charges of felonious assault, accused along with Samuel Hirsch and Samuel Rubin of throwing acid on Brooklyn businessman Mortimer Kahn. The case revived his old reputation. A decade later, in 1941, Fein was arrested again during a raid ordered by District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey. Detectives took Fein into custody along with Abraham Cohen, John Ferraro, and 2 Dallas businessmen, Herman Fogel and Samuel Klein. Authorities alleged the group had purchased a recently stolen garment shipment valued at $10,000. Prosecutors described Fein and Cohen as ringleaders of a criminal operation that had taken in an estimated $250,000 over 3 years through armed robbery and burglary tied to the garment industry. Fein was held in the Tombs awaiting trial. As a 4th-time offender, he faced the possibility of a mandatory life sentence. Instead, he received a reduced sentence of 10 to 20 years. After that conviction, Fein largely disappeared from public record. He died in 1962. Benjamin Dopey Benny Fein belonged to an earlier era of American organized crime, before the national syndicates, before the Commission, before the names that would define the 1930s. He rose in the shadow of sweatshops and union halls where labor disputes were settled with fists and revolvers. He survived multiple murder charges, outlasted rivals, and reinvented himself more than once. His story sits at the beginning of the modern racketeering machine in New York, when control of a factory floor could be as valuable as control of a waterfront. Charles Charlie Birger was born Shachna Itzhak Birger on February 5, 1881, in the Russian Empire. As a child, he immigrated with his Jewish family to St. Louis, Missouri. By 8 years old, he was selling newspapers for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Work came early, so did the instinct to survive. On July 5, 1901, Birger enlisted in the United States Army and was assigned to Company G of the 13th Cavalry Regiment in South Dakota. He served 3 years and was honorably discharged on July 4, 1904 at Fort Meade. After a brief period working as a cowboy, he returned to Illinois, married, and settled in Harrisburg, a booming coal mining town. He worked as a miner and later as a saloon keeper. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, he shifted into bootlegging. Birger aligned with the Shelton brothers and began running liquor through southern Illinois. Pressured by authorities in Saline County, he relocated to Williamson County and built a fortified roadhouse known as the Shady Rest along Old Highway 13 between Harrisburg and Marion. The building was reinforced, guarded, and designed for trouble. Bootlegging expanded into nearby towns, including Dowell, and violence followed. In the early 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan surged in Williamson County, promoting prohibition and targeting immigrant communities. Under leader Seth Glenn Young, Klansmen conducted raids and detained suspected violators. Local officials were forced from office and replaced by Klan allies. On January 24, 1925, violence erupted in Herrin when Deputy Sheriff Ora Thomas confronted Young in a cigar store. Thomas shot Young, Young returned fire, and 2 other Klansmen joined the gunfight. All 4 men died. Young's funeral drew more than 15,000 people, underscoring the Klan's influence. In April 1926, Birger and the Sheltons temporarily united against remaining Klan leadership in Herrin. Armed with Thompson's submachine guns and shotguns, they attacked. 5 men were killed. The coroner ruled the deaths homicides by parties unknown. The Klan's power in the area weakened and the bootlegging war resumed. By late 1926, Birger and the Shelton brothers were at war with each other. Both sides armored trucks into makeshift tanks. The Sheltons even attempted to bomb the Shady Rest from the air, though the dynamite missed. Control of southern Illinois liquor routes was at stake. Joseph Adams, mayor of West City near Benton, became entangled in the conflict. When Birger learned that a Shelton armored truck was being repaired in Adams' garage, he demanded it. After Adams refused, Birger's men bombed his porch. In December 1926, Harry and Elmo Thomason arrived at Adams's home with a supposed letter from Carl Shelton. As Adams read it, they shot him to death. In January 1927, the Shady Rest was destroyed by explosions and fire. 4 bodies were found in the ruins. The act was widely blamed on the Sheltons and marked a turning point. Around the same time, Illinois State Trooper Laurie Price and his wife disappeared. Price was believed to have had ties to Birger, though the circumstances remain unclear. In June 1927, Birger was arrested for ordering the murder of Mayor Adams. He surrendered without resistance. The trial was held in Franklin County outside his sphere of influence. Birger and the Thomason brothers were convicted. The gunman received prison terms for cooperating. Birger was sentenced to death. On April 19, 1928, at the Franklin County Jail in Benton, Birger was hanged. He asked that a rabbi accompany him and chose a black hood, saying he did not want to be mistaken for a Klansman. He shook hands with executioner Philip Hanna. Newspapers reported his final words as, "It's a beautiful world," though local legend claims he said, "It's a beautiful day." Birger was the last man publicly hanged in Illinois. He was buried under his birth name at Chesed Shel Emeth Cemetery in University City, Missouri. In 2006, his name resurfaced when a lawsuit sought possession of the execution noose. Charlie Birger's life followed the arc of prohibition. Immigrant child, soldier, saloon keeper, bootlegger, gang leader. His rise and fall played out in small Illinois towns where politics, race, religion, and organized crime collided in plain sight. When the trapdoor opened in 1928, it closed a violent chapter in southern Illinois history, but the echoes never entirely faded. James Edward O'Donnell, known on Chicago's South Side as Spike, was born on November 29, 1889, in the Canalport area near what is now McKinley Park. He died on August 26, 1962, and was buried at St. Mary Catholic Cemetery in Chicago. His life stretched from the era of street gangs and ward politics into the age of the national crime syndicates. By May 22, 1906, O'Donnell was already in police records, arrested in connection with a ghost payrolling scheme at the Department of Liquor Licensing. In 1912, he ran for the Illinois State Board of Equalization. The campaign ended in a brawl outside a polling place at 48th and Hermitage, where he was arrested for carrying a billy club. He finished 4th out of 5 candidates. Politics and street muscle were intertwined in his world. In 1915, he married Elizabeth Barkal at St. Agnes of Bohemia Church in South Lawndale. By 1916, his name surfaced around labor violence. He worked with Motion Picture Operators Union No. 10 and was briefly suspected in the February bombing of the Boulevard Theatre on West Garfield Boulevard. On March 25, 1916, he survived an attempt on his life outside a building on South Ashland. The following day, he was suspected in the murder of Union associate Hugh Coogan. No conviction followed. On December 5, 1917, the Stockman's Trust and Savings Bank on South Halstead was robbed in broad daylight. 5 days later, O'Donnell and his brother John were held on bond, with authorities alleging Spike planned the robbery. On February 11, 1919, he began serving time at Joliet Penitentiary. He was released in June 1919 on a writ of supersedeas, while appeals continued. In December 1922, he returned to Joliet to serve a 1 to 14-year sentence. In July 1923, he received a full pardon from Illinois Governor Len Small after political backing was organized on his behalf. By the time he walked free, Prohibition had transformed Chicago. From August through December 1923, O'Donnell's crew fought to reclaim territory north of 51st Street in the back of the yards and Gage Park areas from the Saltis McAlane faction, whose alliances tied into the Torrio orbit. The details come largely from later accounts, but the pattern is clear. The Southside beer market was violent and heavily contested. In 1924, O'Donnell reportedly purchased a brewery in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. It was soon shut down by federal agents, with trucks seized and arrests made, including his brother Tom. That same year, he filed a police report claiming he was pickpocketed of $9,700 while attending a parade for Cardinal George Mundelein. The sums he carried reflected the scale of his operations. Violence hit close in 1925. On June 7th, his brother Walter was shot during an altercation at an Evergreen Park roadhouse and died 2 days later. On September 25th, 1925, O'Donnell survived an attack widely described in later histories as one of Chicago's early uses of the Thompson's submachine gun, often attributed to Frank McAlane. 3 weeks later, on October 16th, an ambush near Evergreen Park turned into a major gun battle that drew national attention. By 1926, O'Donnell continued investing in breweries, including one in Thornton, Illinois. On June 29, 1928, he was targeted outside his apartment on West 63rd Street. In October 1928, he and his brother Percy survived another machine gun attack near a garage on South Wood. Later accounts named Joe Saltis and Paddy Sullivan as suspects, though those identifications remain allegations rather than proven court findings. In September 1930, O'Donnell surrendered on a vagrancy warrant and posted bond. In June 1931, his home on South Honore was sprayed with machine gun fire while his family was inside. During a subsequent pursuit, he reportedly dislocated his shoulder. In August 1931, he told police he was leaving for London to pursue an acting career, claiming offers to portray a gangster and even Robin Hood. Whether serious or theatrical, the statement kept his name in headlines. In 1932, tragedy struck again when his brother Charles died from gangrene after being shot in March. Reports that men later broke into O'Donnell's home and assaulted his wife come from secondary sources and were never fully adjudicated in court. By the mid-1930s, O'Donnell's life shifted toward legal disputes and business maneuvering. In 1934, he fractured his hip during a street altercation. In 1936, contractor John M. Bransfield testified that he paid O'Donnell $16,000 to investigate issues tied to state paving contracts. That same year, a judge ordered O'Donnell to pay $35 a month to remain in his foreclosed home. On September 8, 1942, the Internal Revenue Service filed suit alleging he owed $247,601 in unpaid taxes. On March 15, 1943, he was shot in the back near an alley on 83rd Street. Later accounts tied the attack to a disputed paving fee. He survived after surgery at Little Company of Mary Hospital, where a .38 caliber bullet was removed from near his heart. After decades in the crosshairs, Spike O'Donnell did not die in a shootout. He died in 1962, long after the beer wars had faded into history. His life traced Chicago's transformation from neighborhood gang battles to centralized organized crime. He survived the era that made him. Nathan Kaplan, remembered on the streets as Kid Dropper, was born on August 3, 1891, on New York's Lower East Side. He was one of 7 sons born to Joseph Kaplan and his wife, Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire. The Lower East Side at the turn of the century was dense with tenements, pushcarts, and ambition. It was also crowded with young men learning how to survive by any means available. Kaplan's mother died when he was still young. By his early teens, he was already involved in petty theft. He developed a reputation as a skilled sneak thief and pushcart extortionist. His nickname came from the drop swindle, a street con in which a thief would drop a wallet or package in front of a victim, then use confusion and distraction to steal money. The name stuck. On the street, he became Kid Dropper, or Jack the Dropper. In February 1908, at 17 years old, he was arrested for theft and received a suspended sentence. A year later, he was again given a suspended sentence for concealing a weapon. Those early breaks from the courts allowed him to keep building his position in the neighborhood. Like many young criminals of his generation, Kaplan joined a larger gang. He aligned himself with the 5 Points Gang led by Paul Kelly. The 5 Points Gang was largely Italian, though it included Irish and Jewish members. This choice put Kaplan in contrast with many Jewish gang members on the East Side, who gravitated toward the rival Eastman Gang led by Monk Eastman. The alliances of that era were not clean lines drawn by ethnicity alone. They were shaped by personality, loyalty, and opportunity. Among Kaplan's early associates in the 5 Points Gang was Johnny Spanish. At first, the two were friends and criminal partners. By the late 1900s or early 1910s, both had formed their own smaller crews. For a time, their gangs operated as allies. The relationship collapsed over a woman, 19-year-old Beatrice Consant. The dispute turned personal and violent. Before that feud could fully resolve, Kaplan was arrested for robbery and sentenced to 7 years in Sing Sing. Prison interrupted his rise, but did not end it. He was released in 1918, stepping back into a city where labor unrest and post-war tension created new opportunities for men willing to use force. Kaplan entered the world of labor slugging, renting out muscle to unions or employers during strikes. The garment industry, centered in Manhattan, became a battlefield. In the aftermath of the decline of dopey Benny Fein and Joe the Greaser Rosenzweig, Kaplan filled the vacuum. He organized former 5 Points members, including at one point reconciling with Johnny Spanish. The peace did not last. Kaplan and Spanish resumed their rivalry, and Spanish split off again with his own faction. Gunfights followed, particularly in the garment district. On July 29, 1919, Johnny Spanish was shot and killed while leaving a Manhattan restaurant. Contemporary accounts and later histories have suggested Kaplan's involvement, though no conviction followed. At the same time, Jacob Little Augie Organ, another Jewish labor racketeer, was building his own power base. After Organ went to prison, his organization nearly collapsed. With Spanish dead and Organ incarcerated, Kaplan emerged as the dominant labor slugger in New York. He primarily worked for unions, but was known to sell his services to employers when it suited him. Control of strike violence meant control of contracts, and that meant money. By early 1923, the balance shifted again. Organ was released from prison and rebuilt his gang. Among his associates were Jack Legs Diamond, Louis Lepke Buchalter, and Gura Shapiro, names that would later loom large in organized crime. Kaplan and Organ clashed over control of wet-wash laundry workers, and their feud escalated into street shootings. In one confrontation, Kaplan personally assaulted Gura Shapiro with a gun. Organ used the incident strategically, encouraging Shapiro to press charges. On August 28, 1923, Kaplan was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon and brought to Essex Market Court. The arrest drew reporters and onlookers. Kaplan was a known figure, and crowds followed his movements. As he was being transferred to another court under police escort, he stepped toward a police car. In that moment, Organ gunman Louis Kersner approached and fired. Kaplan was shot and killed just after entering the vehicle. He was 32 years old. With Kaplan dead, Jacob Organ took control of his operations. The victory was temporary. Organ himself would be murdered in October 1927 in a killing widely believed to have been arranged by his own associates, including Buchalter and Shapiro, though the exact orchestration has been debated. Nathan Kid Dropper Kaplan lived in a narrow window between the old street gangs of the early 1900s and the more structured crime syndicates that would follow. He rose through deception and violence, dominated labor racketeering for a brief but intense period, and died in broad daylight, surrounded by police and reporters. In that era, power was public. So was the fall. Joseph Francis Saltis was born on September 8, 1894 in Budapest, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born to Rusin parents, Jakob Saltis from Spiš and Maria Polack from the Szarish region near Prešov. In 1905, when Joseph was still a boy, the family immigrated to the United States. Like many immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe at the turn of the century, they were chasing stability and work. Saltis eventually settled in Illinois and became a saloon owner in Joliet. By 1920, when the Volstead Act ushered in national prohibition, he saw what others in his position saw. The legal barroom was gone. The demand for alcohol remained. Chicago was about to become the center of an underground economy measured in truckloads and gunfire. Saltis moved to Chicago with the onset of Prohibition and established himself in the back of the Yards neighborhood, a stockyard district crowded with packing houses, rail lines, and working-class families. With the assistance of John Dingbat Oberta, a politically connected figure who had run for the Illinois State Senate, Saltis began supplying illegal alcohol to local speakeasies. Oberta's political reach provided insulation, at least for a time. By the mid-1920s, Chicago's bootlegging world was consolidating under the growing power of Al Capone and the Chicago Outfit. Capone controlled a network of satellite gangs across the city. The Saltis McAlane organization, led by Saltis and his chief enforcer Frank McAlane, remained one of the few significant operations still independent of Capone's structure. That independence came at a cost. Saltis faced mounting pressure from Capone's affiliates and from other Southside gangs, including the Sheldon Gang and the Southside O'Donnells. Tensions rose in 1925 and 1926 as territory disputes over the back of the yards escalated. Gunmen such as Frank Lefty Consil, Charlie Big Hayes Hubachek, and McAlane formed the core of Saltis's enforcement wing. On August 6, 1926, Sheldon gang member John Mitters Foley was shot and killed inside Saltis territory, allegedly by Frank Consil. Saltis, Consil, and Oberta were arrested and charged with murder. The case was dropped in November 1926, widely attributed to Oberta's political influence and outside assistance. In an effort to calm the escalating violence, a conference was held on October 20, 1926, at the Hotel Sherman in Chicago. The meeting reportedly included Al Capone, George Bugs Moran, Vincent Drucci, Jake Guzik, Ralph Sheldon, and other prominent figures from both the Southside and Northside factions. The goal was a general ceasefire, including peace between the Chicago Outfit and the Northside Gang, as well as an end to the conflict between the Saltis McAlane group and the Sheldon Gang. The truce held for a little over 2 months. On December 30th, 1926, Sheldon gang member Hillary Clements was killed and the fighting resumed. The war for control of the back of the yards intensified. As casualties mounted, Capone began edging further into Saltis territory, recognizing an opportunity while Saltis and the Sheldons weakened each other. On March 11th, 1927, Frank Consul and Charlie Hubachek were lured into an ambush and killed. The loss of key gunmen shook the organization. Saltis reportedly appealed to Capone to broker peace with the Sheldon gang, offering a substantial share of his profits in return. By the end of the conflict, Saltis's power base had eroded. Internal fractures followed. Frank McAlane left the organization in late 1929 amid disputes over profit shares. On March 25, 1930, John Aberta and his chauffeur, Sam Malaga, disappeared after allegedly being taken for what underworld slang called a one-way ride. Their bodies were later found with gunshot wounds to the head. No one was convicted for the killings. Between 1925 and 1929, the Chicago Police Department suspected Saltis of involvement in as many as 20 gangland murders. Those suspicions never translated into convictions, but they defined his reputation. He was known in the press as Polack Joe, a nickname that reflected the ethnic tensions and crude labels common in Chicago reporting of the era. By 1930, Saltis's organization was largely dismantled. Capone's outfit had absorbed or crushed most independent operators. Saltis withdrew from the Chicago underworld and retired to Barker Lake near Winter, Wisconsin. He lived quietly, far from the slaughterhouses and taverns where his name had once carried weight. Even in retirement, he was not forgotten. In April 1930, Frank J. Loesch, chairman of the Chicago Crime Commission, published a list of the city's top public enemies. Saltis appeared on that list, which was widely circulated in newspapers across the country. Al Capone headed the roster. The list cemented Saltis's notoriety even as he stepped away from active crime. Joseph Francis Saltis died on August 2, 1947, at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. He was 53 years old. The cause of death was complications from a stomach ulcer. He did not die in a hail of bullets. He did not fall in an alley. For a man suspected in years of bloodshed, his life ended in a hospital bed. Saltis represents a particular moment in Chicago's criminal history, when independent neighborhood bosses still believed they could hold territory against larger syndicates. In the end, the city's underworld consolidated. The outfit endured. Saltis faded into the background, one more prohibition figure whose rise was violent and whose exit was quiet.